Well, good evening, and welcome to our Exodus Bible study. So, as you know, 2 weeks ago we completed Genesis, and then the week after that we had a introduction to the Passover from one of our Jewish friends, and now we're beginning the second book of the Bible, Exodus. And so we're glad that you are choosing once again to study the Bible with us here at Grace and St. Stephen's. We're having a good time right now. We're starting off. Folks are talking in their small table groups of what do they think we'll find in the book of Exodus? What do they remember and know about the book? Since we're coming to it at the beginning, we tend to have certain things that we remember about something we've read a while ago and other things that we've forgotten. And so we're setting a baseline of knowledge here at the beginning. But we're getting ready to jump into the book of Exodus right now. So thanks for being with us. All right. Well, I hope you had some good discussions at your table concerning the book of Exodus. I'll tell you what I have here is before we get into our chapter today, we're going to have a little bit of an introduction, the layout of the book and how we're going to read it over the next 9 weeks. Hopefully that stays up. Okay, so over the next 9 weeks, we're going to break the book up into 9 sections. And so we're starting today, we're looking at chapters 1 and 2. And I'm calling this the setup. This is the setup to the book. We're starting to see what's going to happen. Pieces are falling into place. And we're going to talk about this, of course, in more detail in just a few minutes. The second section I'm calling Moses and God, Getting to Know You. Because it's easy to forget that this is when Moses meets Yahweh. He's raised Egyptian and runs into God in a burning shrub. And they start to get and says, what's your name? I don't know who you are. How am I going to go tell these people you talked about? I don't even know who you are. So they starting to get to know each other. And the feature that you'll know most of from that section is the burning bush. And the part that you might least remember is the part where God tries to kill Moses. So we'll talk about that next week. That's an interesting part of the book. It's very strange. In week 3, we're going to talk about the plagues, all of them. So that's everything from blood and bugs to even death. That'll be a fun lesson for the kids. I think they'll like that the best. When they do their Bible study on the plagues, they'll have fun with that. In week 4 is the event. So we're going to start week 4. It's going to be about the Passover, but it's also, which we've had some introduction to the Passover a couple weeks ago, but it's also going to be walking through the sea, and it's going to be the praise that follows. So that's the central event. But of course, it's not the only good thing in Exodus. The 5th week, we're going to go with the people into their wanderings in the wilderness, and that's going to be an interesting time. In some ways, it feels a little shocking how discontent the people who were slaves seem to be in the wilderness. But we'll have some time to talk about that, why that might be the case. But it usually, I think, for folks when they read through, like we're reading through, and they get to that section, right after walking through the sea, it feels a little jarring that things have already gone south so quickly. We'll have a good time talking about that, though. The sixth week, we're going to talk about law and covenant. So specifically, we're going to talk, this is the 10 Commandments part of the book. So this will be the Exodus version of the 10 Commandments. We'll spend some time with that. In the 7th week, it's building plans. So this will be a really fun lesson for Helen and the kids. They can spend a lot of time talking about the exact dimensions of a tent, and you'll have a lot of fun reading chapters and chapters on the blueprints for the tabernacle. But there's a lot of there's some really meaningful parts of that. But it is a lot of specific dimensions and building materials. In the 8th week, it's going to be the section on the golden calf, and also how God and Moses respond to that event. And then the final week, I called God Makes a Home, and that is going to be our opportunity to see the tent built one of the times that the people really do follow God's commandments and get it right, and God shows up and lives with them. And so that is what we have coming up in Exodus. There's a lot of great stories in Exodus, and we're going to have a good time talking about it. So we're going to start tonight, though. So we begin with something of a bridge. The beginning of Exodus is something of a bridge between Genesis and the Exodus event. In the first few verses, you probably noticed, they recall the end of Genesis, right? So they include a reminder of Joseph's death. We're reminded of his brothers in the tribes. We're reminded of his father, Israel. So the end of Genesis is recapped at the beginning of Exodus. But immediately, we see there's a problem. So we get the setup, but we also recognize there's a problem right away in the book of Exodus. And the problem is, Joseph is dead, which we knew because we read the end of Genesis. But the problem is, the new Pharaoh, does not remember Joseph. So immediately the author gives us a hint that something bad is going to happen. Because that memory is gone, so is the relationship, so is the goodwill. Joseph is dead, and the Pharaoh is new, and the people are too prosperous. That's the problem. And that brings us immediately in the book to the Pharaoh's solution, which begins first with slavery. And then when that doesn't work, he turns to infanticide, meant as long-term genocide or ethnic cleansing. And that is how Moses ends up in the river, and then eventually in the home of Pharaoh. And we know that it'll be his salvation, Moses' salvation, that will ensure the salvation of the people. So that's how we start the book of Exodus, with a crisis. Genesis ended with a good story. The brothers came back together. They reconciled with Joseph. They found a place in a land that was prosperous. They survived the 7 years of drought. They were accepted and welcomed in Egypt. That was the good news. And we start Exodus with the bad news. Time has passed, and that good situation is no longer the case. So there's a lot in the first two chapters. So these chapters, they create continuity with the first book of the Bible, Genesis, and they foreshadow what is yet to come in Exodus. So not only is the author drawing back on the past, we're also getting a sense of what might happen coming up. When we read the entire story, we are going to be able to look back on Genesis chapters 1 and 2 and see these events, which in some ways, to the original audience at the beginning, probably seemed not terribly significant, take on great significance. If you just say, at the beginning of Exodus, there's this terrible thing happening, one baby gets put in a river, and he gets pulled out by the Pharaoh's daughter, that might not seem like a big deal. It might seem like a situation where, well, that's good for that one baby. But when we read through the entire narrative, we recognize that what was good for that one baby actually is good for the entire nation. It's important to remember in Exodus that the details serve the story. What I mean by that is, ultimately, the book of Exodus came together over a long period of time. So, what that means is it wasn't that there was one person who sat down one day and started writing Exodus, got through the 40 chapters, and then was like, okay, it's good. Send it off to the publisher. That's not how it came together. Now, we saw the same thing in Genesis, right? That there were different literary traditions, and sometimes we saw some contradictions. Sometimes we saw the same story told twice from two different perspectives. That's the same kind of thing that will happen in Exodus, although it's edited in such a way that where you would have two creation stories in Genesis and Exodus, those details are there's more of an intentional, more intention around bringing it together as one narrative. But still, that means that we need to remember that the details serve the larger story, that it was assembled from different traditions and that the final form, until the final form came together. There are then a variety of literary styles in the book of Exodus. It's not just one style of literature. So we're going to see story and narrative. Obviously, we've noticed that already. But we're also going to find that there are sections of poetry, where there'll be a break in the narrative for poetry. There'll be a break in the narrative for song. There is a section for code of law. There are formulas for worship, so instruction of how right worship is done. They break from just the narrative strain. They fit into the larger narrative, but it's almost like an aside. And there are times, because this is brought together from traditions and over time, there are going to be some parts of the text where it will feel like a contradiction or will be difficult to reconcile. So, and we saw this again. We also saw this in Genesis, right? And remember in our discussions that the original audience for these books, they were very comfortable with that, in a way that sometimes 20th and 21st century Westerners have some discomfort. I think we discussed this in Genesis. Having two versions of the same story side by side for us is difficult. For them, not an issue. In fact, when they edited the text, they left them in. They didn't even. What I think our tendency would be was try to make them all fit together and be the same thing. But that in the ancient mind, ancient Israel, it was okay to have two perspectives on one event. That was okay. As long as it's not to the point where, we're going to find later in the histories there are some things that just flat out disagree. And that was okay. That was considered, it's a community's book, so it's okay to have a variety of perspectives from within the community involved in a sacred text. And so we'll see some of that in Exodus, not as obvious as we did in Genesis, but we will still see that some in Exodus. So what we'll see is, for example, we're told that there are two midwives for all of the Hebrews, right? So Pharaoh goes to these two midwives for all of the Hebrews. However, later in the text, we're going to be told that there were 600,000 men who were Hebrew, not including children or women. So, Carol's a midwife. Two for a population of 1 million would not be a lot. And so, right, so there would be a lot of complications. And you remember, I think, this is a long time ago, there was not birth control. So people were probably having some babies. And so if there were two midwives for a population of 1 million, it would say that those two traditions had a slightly different version of the story. Right, so the one with 2 midwives is probably imagining a smaller population. The one with 600,000 men plus women and children probably was not even thinking about the midwives. There's a different reason for that. And so there are at times, either because of different literary sources or because the authors value other purposes more highly than historical accuracy. So these are theological texts. They're more concerned about what does this say about God and our relationship with God than they are sometimes about the historical details. So some of the details are going to be difficult to reconcile, and that's okay. That's what we'll have those conversations together. Ultimately, though, for the authors of Exodus, the details are less important than the central story, which is the story of salvation history. The details serve the story of salvation history. The Redeemer God and a people redeemed to carry on God's salvific work. That's what's important. Some folks will look at the book of Exodus and they'll say, it's the people are saved from and the people are saved for. That would be one way to look at it. It's a salvation story. God rescues them for a reason. and that's to continue the story of salvation to the rest of the world, right? So that's most important to the authors and editors of Exodus, is to tell the story of God and salvation. And it's a story that started with the creation. And these details were put in creation, this relationship that God had with humanity in God's continual process of salvation. And so that story continues in Exodus. There are, in this beginning of Exodus, and we mentioned some, there are many allusions to Genesis in the beginnings of Exodus. Some of them quite subtle, some of them even obscured by English translations. So we already noted the recap of the end of Genesis that opens Exodus. A list of the sons, reminder of Joseph's death. But there are other allusions as well. So let's look at those. We see, for example, in the very beginning of the book, in verse 7 of the first chapter, that the Israelites were fruitful and they multiplied. Now, we just studied Genesis. That should sound familiar, right? That was God's commandment in the very first creation story. Be fruitful and multiply. And not only that, it was part of the promise that God gave to all of the ancestors in Genesis. It was the promise that you will be fruitful and you will multiply. That you will have, as Abram, children as many as the sands or as many as the stars. Right? That was always part of the promise, but it was a part of the promise that started in the first creation story. It was the promise again after the flood. Go, be fruitful and multiply. And it was the promise that was shared with all of the ancestors. And now we see in the beginning of Exodus, because we know Genesis, we recognize the promise is being fulfilled. God promised and commanded, be fruitful and multiply. The people were fruitful and multiplied in Egypt. The sons of Israel were fruitful and multiplied. They're obedient to God's command, and God is fulfilling the promise of creation. It was all through Genesis. It begins Exodus as well. We also, if we look at the beginning, if we look at the beginning of the Moses story, we see there's another. We're also reminded of Genesis, and I think this is an interesting one. So, baby Moses is put in a basket and placed in the water. We know that was part of the story. There was an attempted genocide. All the baby boys, or the Hebrews, were supposed to be killed. Moses' mother puts him in a basket, puts him in the water. It's interesting to note. I had a feeling that was going to happen. We already covered that, so it doesn't matter. It's interesting to note that the Hebrew word that is translated as basket here in this story in Exodus, in the baby Moses story, is only used in one other story in the entire Bible. And that is the Noah story. The word that's translated basket in the Moses story is the same word that is translated as ark in the Noah story. If you're reading Genesis to Exodus in Hebrew, that would probably stand out. Where you would say, they're different stories, they're in different books, but they're a part of the same salvation story. Noah and his family are saved in the same way that the people will be saved through Moses. So the basket becomes Noah's ark. It becomes Moses' ark, and Noah's ark is basically like his basket. Same word, translated differently in English, and so it'd be easy to miss that. But it's an interesting way that Exodus draws back into the early history of Genesis to carry on this continuity. I think that's an interesting part of the story. There is a lot of, in this beginning in this beginning of Exodus, I think that it probably really stands out, it certainly did to me, probably to you as well, the role that women play in these first 2 chapters of Exodus. And so, we're going to talk a little bit about that, but I want to begin with what I thought was an interesting poem called Epitaph by Eleanor Wilner. Though only a girl, the firstborn of the Pharaoh, I was the first to die. It's a story of the daughter of Pharaoh. Young then, we were bored already, rouged pink as oleanders on the palace grounds, petted by the eunuchs, overfed from gem-encrusted bowls, barren with wealth, until the hours of the afternoon seemed to outlast even my grandmother's mummy, a perfect little dried apricot in a golden skin. We would paint to pass the time with delicate brushes dipped in char on clay or on our own blank lids. And so it was that day we found him, wailing in the reeds. He seemed a miracle to us, plucked from the lotus by the ibis beak, the squalling seed of the sacred Nile. He was permitted us as a toy. While I pretended play, I honed him like a sword. For him, I was as polished and as perfect as a pebble in a stutterer's mouth. While the slave's fans beat incessantly as insect wings, I taught him how to hate this painted Pharaoh's tomb, this palace built of brick and dung, and gilded like a poet's tongue, these painted eyes. So let's talk about women in the first 2 chapters of Exodus. Women play a very significant role in God's work. One thing we're going to notice about Exodus, God is at work throughout the entire book, but it's not as direct as we get in the creation stories, for example. So in a lot of ways, God's choosing people to work through, as opposed to being as hands-on as we saw in some of the early stories of Genesis. And so this is the case here. First off, it's important for us to notice the contrast in the text. Pharaoh ignores women altogether, right? He asks the midwives and then the people to kill the boys and to let the little girls live. Now, there could be a number of reasons, a number of terrible reasons for that decision, but it is clear in the narrative that Pharaoh considers women to be weak and harmless. Well, it turns out he's wrong, right? I mean, we see that in the text. 5 women work with God to set up what will be the Pharaoh's demise. And so there's some interesting irony at the beginning of the book. The people who are considered the most harmless are the ones who begin the crumbling of the empire and ultimately the Pharaoh's demise. And so first we have 2 midwives. Now it's interesting to note that the midwives have names in the story. The Pharaoh does not. So this is important for the authors, right? The Pharaoh's nameless. The 2 midwives are intentionally named. And they practice this really interesting creative civil disobedience. They save lives by tricking the Pharaoh, a man who clearly does not understand childbirth. Right? So not only do they disobey a direct order, an order from someone who shows clearly they have no problem killing people. I mean, it's sort of part of his style. And so they go back and they say, well, these women, they just have babies too fast. We can't. It's so fast we can't even get to them in time. You love it? Love it. So I'm guessing, maybe Pharaoh was not present for the birth of his own children, assuming he had any. I think so. He clearly doesn't know, but they take a huge chance, and it's through their work and risking their own lives that many, many lives would have been saved. And then there's Moses' mom and his sister, who craft a brilliant plan that not only preserves Moses' life, but as a bonus, Moses' mom gets paid to raise her own son. That's a pretty good plot. And they had that set up pretty well. I mean, that was pretty good. We don't know for certain that they knew exactly where the Pharaoh's daughter would go down into the river to bathe, but they seem they have planned it out pretty well. I mean, Moses' sister was even waiting there, so that as soon as the baby was found, she could run up and say, "Hey, you need someone to raise your child?" I mean, it's a good plan. It's a good plan. And then there's Pharaoh's daughter, who I think is really interesting. She is an Egyptian, the daughter of the Pharaoh, and she plays an essential role in the salvation story of the Hebrew people. She uses her privilege to save a life. A lot of people in the story don't have a lot of privilege. Certainly not Moses' mother and sister. They're a part of the people who are being enslaved, part of the people who the Pharaoh's trying to wipe out. But Pharaoh's daughter would have a certain privilege. And she too, like the midwives, she commits an act of civil disobedience. She very clearly defies her father's orders, the king's orders. Not only does she not kill the baby, which she is commanded to do, we see in the text, Pharaoh says to his people, he commands the people to kill any male children of the Hebrews. So this is a command that's gone out. The Pharaoh's daughter knows it. She doesn't kill the baby. But not only that, she takes the baby in and ensures that Moses is raised as an Egyptian with all of the power and privilege that would afford him as being essentially the adopted grandson of the Pharaoh. It's a pretty bold move by the Pharaoh's daughter, but again, ends up being a significant part of God's salvation story. God uses 5 women to change the world and preserve salvation history. I think it's also important when we look at the beginning of Exodus to remember what kind of story this is. Now, we can look at it and we can say, well, it has a happy ending. The people get out of Egypt, and that's true. But the beginning of the story is a terrible story. It's a story of a tyrant. It's a story of ethnic cleansing. So let's talk about a little bit about the context of the story. This story takes place during the reign of a tyrant, story of ethnic cleansing. And I think it's important to remember with that we're going to find out in chapter 12 of Exodus that the Hebrew people have been in Egypt for 400 years. That's a long time. These are not folks who just came in the week before and the Pharaoh said we have to do something about it. This is a group of people who have been living in Egypt for 400 years, according to Exodus 12. So in some ways, it's not surprising that the Pharaoh would no longer know the story of Joseph. So at first it seems like, well, a new Pharaoh rose to power and he didn't remember Joseph. And it seems like, well, wouldn't the previous Pharaoh or someone else have said, oh, yeah, the reason those people are there is because with the last Pharaoh, they played a really important role in saving our people. But when you realize that it's been 400 years, it's a little more understandable that this Pharaoh wouldn't necessarily remember Joseph. He died almost 400 years before. But it also means, on the other hand, that the Israelites have been there 400 years. Now, it might not have been their ancestral homeland, but it certainly was their home. So let's think of it this way. 400 years ago for us would be 1660. That's a long time ago. Now, not many of our families have been in this land for that long, since 1616. It's possible that a couple families would date back that far, but it's unlikely, right? Now, even though not many of us have roots back into the beginning of the 1600s, the beginning of the 17th century, I suspect that many of us, I know I do, that even though we know our ancestors came from other lands and other nations, I know a lot of my ancestors came from the British Isles, I know some of my wife's ancestors came from Lebanon and Syria, so we know that about ourselves, but we still consider the U.S. our homeland. I mean, I certainly do. I don't think of like, well, I've lived in the U.S. all my life, but actually, my homeland is England. I don't think that. I could think of that might be, well, my ancestors came from there, but certainly I consider myself a U.S. American. I suspect many of you do as well. It's been a long time. You don't even know what year. I don't even know what year my first ancestors came to this country. But this would be my homeland. And I suspect, in some ways, it's important to look at the story in that way, that the Hebrew people had been in Egypt for 400 years. It was not their ancestral homeland, but it would have been home. Their children and children and children and children would have never known any other place for generations. And so what this is, in the beginning of Exodus, is an ethnic cleansing. Because while they've lived there for a long time, they were not Egyptian, ethnically. They were seen as a threat to a certain ethnic purity or standard in Egypt. They looked at the people and said, there's some, they've been here a long time, but they're not really us. And so the Pharaoh decides he's got to do something about this, because they're not real Egyptians, right? So he rounds them up and makes them slaves to the real Egyptians. And the author of Exodus is quick to point out that the slavery was oppressive and mentions multiple times that it was ruthless. And it made the people's lives bitter. So that's what we read in Exodus. It's oppressive, ruthless, and made the lives of the people bitter. So this is not a good thing. It's important for us to realize how bad the situation was. And that was not enough. So the slavery that was oppressive and ruthless and made the people's lives bitter was not enough. And so the next step was to have the midwives, these two midwives to the Hebrews that we talked about earlier, kill all the baby boys. Now, we're not sure why it was the boys. In some ways, you could make a better argument for infanticide against the female babies, because they were using the population as slave labor. And so you would think they'd want to preserve male slave labor. And without girls, there would be no procreation, no new babies. But it could be that the Egyptians traced their family line through males. And so the idea was this was a way of killing the future at the source. That if the family line ran through the men and there were no men, they would lose their history. And so they would no longer be a people. Women would probably be absorbed into the greater population, right? So we've already talked a little bit about the irony of this decision. Pharaoh thought little of females, but God thought a lot of them, and God was right. We talked about that. And we also know that the midwives refused to do his order, and they risked their own lives, and they saved many other lives. And as we noted earlier, they proved themselves cleverer than the ruler of the empire. And so because that plan also did not work, Pharaoh commands his people. I think this is where we can really understand how ruthless and terrible the story is. He commands his people to kill babies. If you see a male baby in the Hebrews, one of your neighbors, you are ordered by the emperor to kill that baby. Can you imagine? So he commands them to commit genocide. And as terrible as the story is, we should note, because it's important to remember, that this was not the last time a tyrant called for a genocide. Many, many times. So we look at this story and we think, how terrible, and it is, but even more terrible that something like this is preserved as a horrible thing in one of the most read books in the history of the world, if not the most read book in the history of the world, and yet it continued to happen by people who claim to be Christian, right? Who would be familiar with these stories. It was not the last time that fear and anxiety have been used to turn people against their neighbors. That's part of the story. The whole thing starts because the Pharaoh's afraid and he gets his people afraid. He said, you know what's going to happen? They're all going to turn against us. They're not really us. They're not like us. Some foreign power is going to come from the outside and convince them to fight against us. They're against us. We got to do something about this. That's what starts the whole thing. That's happened before. It's happened since. It was not the last time that the rhetoric of racial purity and ethnic purity have been used for political gain. That's happened many, many times since this story. I mean, because that's the problem. They had lived there 400 years. So it's not that they were just so new to the scene that they thought, well, they're not really us. They just came here last week. It's not that they're not our kind of people. They had been there for 400 years. Folks were able to look at them and say, yeah, they've been here for 400 years, but they're not real Egyptians. We got to get rid of them. Or wipe them out. So unfortunately, that's happened since. And we need to remember that one of the reasons the story has been so important historically is because this story has played out over and over again throughout human history. In some ways, we can look at a story like this and say, is everything in Exodus historically factual? And we could say, well, maybe not. There's not a lot of outside evidence historically to 1 million people leaving Egypt. That would have been an enormous number of people 5,000, 4,000 years ago. Enormous. It would have been noted. People would have noticed that. But we can say, whether or not the numbers are correct, the story is very believable. It's happened many, many times. It's unfortunate that it's believable, but it's not hard to get there. We see tons of parallels in history. We can see parallels in our world today. It's important that we remember that, and it's also important that we recognize that one of the reasons the Exodus event has been so important historically is that those being oppressed can look at the story for hope. That God will once again fight for the brutalized and the powerless people in the world. That is why this story has been so important to people. That's why the African slaves in our country connected so strongly with a story like the Exodus. Because it said, well, maybe there's a chance. God did it then. Maybe God will do it again. That's one of the reasons this story becomes so central. Because there's still people who can relate to it and who still look to it for hope. And in fact, the people of Israel throughout the Old Testament have other times in the Old Testament history when they're looking back at the Exodus and saying, another empire is oppressing us. Babylon or Assyria. Maybe again God can do this. That's why this story becomes so important. We see it in places like Daniel. We see it in places like the Magnificat. We see it in the book of Revelation. People being oppressed who can look back to this event and say, but I know that God saves people like me. Now, the thing that's hard about this story is it also reminds us that there are times when God chooses sides. And what we are reminded, then, is it's important for us to choose wisely. Next week, we're going to be reading chapters 3 through 7, verse 7. And it's going to sound like that's a strange place to end when I say it now. But when you're reading it, you'll recognize that it makes sense. So that's what we'll discuss next week, chapters 3 through 7:7. And I encourage you, if you have questions as you're reading, to go ahead and put them in the little question box over here. Or you are welcome to email me if you have questions that you would like me to address next week when we have our discussion time. I want to thank everybody for going not just through Genesis, but also taking the journey through Exodus as well. I hope that you've been enjoying your reading, and I hope that it's bringing the Scriptures more and more to life. They really are very relevant still today. Thank you very much.